Hello, I'm Dr. Elena Roberts, and today I will be talking to you about exclusion and inclusion in United States history. First, I will give you a broad overview of one way our country has fluctuated between exclusion and inclusion of people in various demographic groups. Then, I will finish up with a case study that will demonstrate that we must include discrimination between people of color in our discussions about exclusion and inclusion in American history. I use PowerPoint in this presentation, so each time I show you a slide, I will give you time to read it and take it in. When I was in elementary school, middle school, and high school, I learned about American history as a progression. The United States is born in 1776, slavery comes about, Americans realize slavery is bad, we have the Civil War, then slavery is over, and then the Civil Rights Movement gets rid of racism. A very neat idea of how the United States is supposedly constantly improving, with Americans involving themselves in institutions like slavery, but then abolishing these systems when they realize that they're bad. Maybe you learned something similar. But now, as a professor and a historian, it's my job to teach that actually American history is far more complex, full of ups and downs, and many times when this country as a whole, or various states, have taken really one step forward and then later 2 steps back. Let me tell you what I mean with regard to our topic, exclusion and inclusion. One of the key concepts we associate with the United States is the freedom to vote. But as I'm sure you've seen in recent years, this freedom is something that is constantly being negotiated. And this was also the case in the 1700s. When the Founding Fathers wrote the Declaration of Independence and then the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, voting was not among their priorities, even though we might think that this was one of the most important distinctions between a monarchy that they wanted to leave and the new country that they wanted to create. You're probably quite familiar with these documents, but let's take a close look at a few parts of them, starting chronologically with the Declaration of Independence. There are just a few slices of this important document that I want to show you. There are verbatim quotes from various parts of the Declaration, and I'll give you a minute or so to look at them. Together, these excerpts give us a general idea of the Founding Fathers' issues with their monarch, King George III, and really with the entire political system of monarchy. By declaring their belief that all men are created equal, the colonists were then at odds with the items that they outlined in the Declaration, particularly the fact that the king had ultimate power over legislation. He could create it or refuse to, and he could ignore the legislative decisions made by colonists, or just make it really difficult for them to even gather together to make these kinds of decisions. So you would think that the people's right to have a free say in legislation through voting would be first and foremost in the Founding Fathers' minds when they were triumphant in the Revolution. And then they succeed in creating the United States. And they do discuss voting, but it doesn't make it into the Bill of Rights. Through the 1770s and on, men like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and more are having many conversations about what voting might look like and whether the average person should even have a direct say. Should it already be one man, one vote on every single issue? Should every person get to elect someone who then votes for them on various issues? Should only a certain group of men get to vote? There are many formats and options, but most of them revolve around the idea that only some people, some men, are qualified to vote, and therefore that voting is not a universal right that is foundational to this new country. From the original Articles of Confederation to the Bill of Rights, we have things like this. You may have noticed, or you already knew, that there is no universal right to vote here. In 1789, George Washington, this country's first president, is elected not by people like you and I, regular folks, but by electors, who were often community leaders or wealthy and well-known men. The electors had to be white men, and the citizens who chose the electors were also almost all white men. So if we can all agree that voting is one very important way to distinguish who our country allows to participate fully in its political and social systems, then this is a sign that right away, right after it's born, the United States already has ideas of who is and is not included in this group of people who are qualified to vote. This group is not all men created equal, like the Declaration of Independence claims. In almost every state, it's white men who must own land. But there were exceptions. And New Jersey is actually a state that is an exception to this rule for a period of time. And so this is where we get my idea of one step forward, two steps back that I mentioned at the beginning of my time with you. After they decided to break from Britain, each colony, which became each state, had to create its own constitution. The first New Jersey Constitution, issued in 1776, granted the right to vote to all inhabitants who were 21 years of age or older, who resided in one county for at least 1 year, and who owned property worth at least 50 English pounds. We haven't totally gotten away from property ownership, which still drastically narrows the amount of people who can vote, and of course maintains an element of economic inequality because property is wealth. So a poor or a working person is still not voting in New Jersey. But this phrase, all inhabitants, does theoretically allow for property owning women and property owning Black men to vote. Now, historians disagree about whether this sort of loophole was purposeful. New Jersey was the state where there was a growing number of abolitionists and a small but strong number of property-owning women. So it's possible that at the Constitutional Convention, the delegates truly did want the state to be more open-minded than many others. It's also a possibility that it was just an oversight, and they thought that it would just be obvious that they were only referring to white men, since previously that had been the case. And that's the fun and often frustrating part of history, that there are always multiple interpretations and very rarely one truth. But regardless of whether or not it was on purpose, women, predominantly white women, and Black men took advantage of this general language that did not specifically bar them from voting. New Jersey was the only state where women are thought to have voted in this period. And in 1790, one law even described a voter as he or she. So New Jersey is then becoming more explicit about the inclusion of women over time. New Jersey's women's level of electoral participation from the 1780s to 1780s is unclear, but what is clear is that there was pushback. In 1797, a New Jersey legislature seat was up for grabs, and it was a very tight race. White women ended up being the deciding factor for the winner, who was a Jeffersonian Republican from Newark. Then in 1806, again, a very tight race, this time to determine the site of a new county courthouse. And this was decided by a substantial turnout of white women. So unfortunately, you might know what's going to happen next. Because of this electoral power that women exercised in these two votes, they became the topic of conversation and debate. People asked, is it really okay that women are voting? Are they qualified? Are Black men qualified? Is this what the state constitution originally outlined? Then the next year, the state legislature passed a law clarifying that the state constitution's all inhabitants did not actually refer to women or to people of color, and that only free white men were allowed to vote. This is not the march of American progress that we're taught. After the revolution, women in New Jersey got new rights. But when certain people didn't like how they exercised those rights, they were taken back. Is that right? In Pennsylvania, where I currently live, there was a similar situation. In the colonial period, Pennsylvania allowed free African American men who owned substantial land holdings to vote. Since Pennsylvania, and especially Philadelphia, had a free large Black population, there were opportunities for African Americans to gain wealth by creating businesses that served whites and Blacks. But still, there weren't that many of these wealthy Black men. Like all states, Pennsylvania's constitution went through multiple changes. This was the wording of the 1790 Pennsylvania constitutional article on voting. Like in New Jersey, the language left voting up to interpretation. Did this free man refer only to white men, or did it include Black men too? Well, at this point, the Constitution had already been ratified, and it didn't necessarily matter what the writers had originally intended, because many of the Black leaders in Philadelphia wrote to the state legislature, including proof that they were owners of property and taxpayers, and saying that they felt this allowed them to vote. Then they went to the polls and successfully voted, although they often faced harassment or violence. And this lasted for almost 40 years. This is not something we usually learn about because we're traditionally taught that Black voting happens only after the Civil War. In 1838, Pennsylvania held a constitutional convention to try to lessen property requirements so that even more people, both Black and white, could vote. So this is trying to get at that economic inequality in that property requirement. But this didn't go over well with some people. A group of Democrats lobbied to use this convention to actually ban Black men from voting. In response, several free African American men got together to create what they called the Appeal of 40,000 Citizens Threatened with Disenfranchisement. And inside this pamphlet, they used the fact that the American Revolution was fought for freedom and equality as the reason why they should get to keep their right to vote. And another paragraph. And so in this pamphlet, they mention the hypocrisy of considering stripping only one group of people's rights while claiming that all men are created equal. They mention that their love for their country, even though they were brought here as slaves, and they don't necessarily have any reason to like it, but they do. They mention their patriotism, and then they go on to outline their knowledge of not just the Constitution of the United States, but also of the state's constitution. This is eloquent. This is respectful. And yet, what ends up happening at this convention, instead of discussing how, of course, Black men have the right to vote, we should only broaden instead of narrow our idea of citizenship. Instead, thousands of white Pennsylvanians petitioned the convention to remove suffrage from African Americans completely. And over the course of several days, they also destroy and set on fire several important buildings in the free Black Philadelphia community, like churches and storefronts. This is a drawing of one fire. The places targeted by this mob were places that represented Black success, churches, meeting halls, and the property of Black leaders. The destruction totaled about $4,000 at the time, which in today's money is around $116,000. But why all this destruction? Well, the broader context is that the anti-slavery movement was growing, and African Americans in the state had grown more politically active, holding large conventions in Philadelphia to discuss political and social activism. And so, in response, some white people felt more threatened than they had before, and they lashed out, wanting to restrict African American rights in return. And it wasn't even just about voting. It was also about Black people continually advocating for the abolition of slavery and gaining more supporters. Remember, this is only about 20 years before the start of the Civil War. In the end, the Constitutional Convention ended up opening suffrage to lower class whites, but putting an end to voting for African American men, with convention attendees ratifying a new state constitution that specifically limited voting to white free men only. And it would not be until after the Civil War that Black men would be able to vote again in Pennsylvania. Well, let's ask this question again. Why wouldn't we be taught this? Is it because it calls into question the idea of a straight line of American progress? Is it because if we knew that Black voting already existed way back in the 1700s, we would know that our country had already made the right choice and then decided to cruelly take it back? I've given you some background on voting in this country and two specific examples of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. But if we go even broader, we have 10 states that early on originally allowed property owning Black men and or women to vote. By the early 1800s, that number had gotten smaller because of changes like those in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So what does this tell us about exclusion and inclusion in early American history? How would it change the way you understood American history if you had learned this in middle school or high school? I don't think it makes you hate your country to know that history is more complex. You just realize that it's not perfect. The American Revolution really was revolutionary. It made colonists, who were now Americans, think harder about race and gender and class. And it led to a number of states deciding that they weren't interested in continuing slavery, or they weren't interested in completely blocking off all rights to women or Black men. They wanted to change, but there will always be groups of people who don't want more people to have more freedom and who don't want more people to have rights. And that's what we see here in these examples. A small minority of people who convinced others to exclude everyone but white men from many rights and privileges that the American Revolution was based upon. Pennsylvania especially is an example of how race and class can collide. We don't often talk about class in this country, but at the convention in Philadelphia, it was predominantly poor whites who started this mob that destroyed Black property. They were afraid of African Americans having more wealth or more power than them. And so they worked to shut down one of the few rights that free African Americans had access to. And they tried to destroy the economic success they had obtained. Because if African Americans were seen as the lowest, most powerless class, then poor white men could still feel that they were superior to someone. And this is what we see often with Southern slavery. Most white people in the South didn't own slaves, but they supported the system of slavery because then there was someone politically, socially, and economically underneath them. And that's very unfortunate because there are times in history that poor white men and Black men and women and other groups of people have come together and achieved gains and seen how similar they really are. But it didn't happen often enough. Now, what I've just discussed with voting rights and Black and white Americans continues the sort of Black-white dichotomy we often see in American history. And rightfully so, these two groups of people are very important. But there was one other major group of people that is essential to understanding this country's early history, and that's Native Americans. Native American voting is a complex issue. The majority of Native Americans were not citizens of this country until the 19th century at the earliest, and that citizenship didn't necessarily come with voting rights. But many Native people didn't want to vote or didn't want to have American citizenship until the 20th century, because that meant being absorbed into the United States instead of being considered part of their own sovereign Indian nations. Now, I've included a great book on this topic in your syllabus, but for now, I want to discuss a related issue, because it was not only white Americans who had to deal with deciding whether African Americans would have access to rights like voting. Today, there are over 500 Indian nations, and in the 1700s and 1800s, there were even more. 5 of these Indian nations had members who owned Black slaves, and those 5 tribes these are also some of the biggest Indian nations today, so you may be familiar with one or more of these names. Usually it's the Cherokees. So how and why did these Native women and men own slaves? Well, there are 2 major reasons. First, they were being pressured by American traders they did business with and the American politicians that they made agreements with to not only own enslaved Black people as property, but also to assimilate to American culture in other ways, like learning English, teaching their daughters and wives to weave, and engaging in agriculture and private property ownership. White Americans believed that if Native Americans' culture was inferior and uncivilized, then they could change it by becoming more like white people. This would allow them to survive. Now, this is, of course, racist and ridiculous, and Native people were aware of this. They certainly didn't think that they were inferior to white people. But some of them did see the benefit of things like learning English and sending their children to American schools, because then they could better negotiate with Americans. So the important context behind this transition into Native American slave ownership is this harmful attempt by Americans to erase Native culture and encourage assimilation. This is referred to as the civilization policy in the 1700s, but this really continues throughout the 1800s and the 1900s as well. But the other reason that many Native Americans decided to engage in slave ownership was the same reason that white Americans did, and that was to make money. Some members of these southeastern tribes decided that it would benefit them to take a part in the system, which really kind of resembled their pre-contact captivity practices. And there's also a book in your syllabus about that. Their homelands in Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and North Carolina were conducive to success in the planter economy. They could easily use enslaved people to plant cotton or corn or tobacco because their lands were agriculturally rich. This is an image of the plantation of one of the wealthiest Cherokee slave owners by the name of James Vann. It's 2 stories with a third half story. It has a basement and a wine cellar, and the property included a blacksmith shop, 42 slave cabins, 6 barns, 5 smokehouses, a trading post, over 1,000 peach trees, and 147 apple trees. So suffice to say, this is not the sort of property that we usually think of a Native American inhabiting in the 1800s, but this is the wealth that slaveholding provided. You can actually go see the Vann House today. It's located in Northwest Georgia, and it's actually been made into a museum. So just to give you a sense of how slavery becomes so important to these nations, in 1837, a census is taken of another of these slaveholding nations, the Chickasaw Nation, and it found that there were 1,223 slaves and 255 owners. That made enslaved people about 18% of the Chickasaw population, which Maybe that doesn't sound like much, but that is actually approximately the same percentage of slaves there were in Georgia in the same time period. And so Georgia, of course, we think of as a state where slavery is very important. And so what was life like for the Black slaves of these Native Americans? Well, as far as labor, just as in the South, the Black slaves of Indians performed various tasks within agricultural field labor or domestic work. Both in the South and in these Indian nations, there were slave codes that prohibited Black people from learning to read and write, from assembling in large groups. There was also a lot of similarity with regard to restrictions put on enslaved Black people, and this is because both white slave owners and Native slave owners were afraid of slave revolts. But there were also some important differences between slaves of white Americans and slaves of Indians. Slaves of Indians had the opportunity to perform different functions. They often served as interpreters in political and religious realms. Since most of them had been previously owned by white people, they spoke English, unlike many of their Indian owners, who usually only spoke their native language. And what these enslaved people learned in Indian language to communicate with their owners, they were then able to serve as go-betweens when traders or governmental agents traveled through these nations. They also sometimes served as religious teachers for their owners, reading the Bible to them and preaching to them. Again, prior ownership to whites had exposed them to this, to Christianity. Let's take a look at how slaves owned by Indians described their lives. These are the real words of formerly enslaved people who are reminding us that everyone's experience of slavery was different. Some people had horribly cruel owners, while others did not. But either way, if your life can be irreparably changed by someone else's whims, you're not free. You're not living a good life. In the 1830s, these slave-owning Indians came under attack, both physically and legally, because of this agriculturally rich land that allowed them to plant and make money from the sale of their harvest. White plantation owners wanted this land for themselves. And so essentially, this is how we get Indian removal. You probably were already familiar with removal, but it takes on a little more complexity when you learn that the Native people being forced off their land so that white Americans could build plantations were also themselves slave owners with plantations. They did what Americans had told them to do. They did what Americans had told them would make them civilized and seen as equals. And yet, when Americans wanted their land, this was not enough to stop them. Now, the Cherokees fought removal. They launched 2 court cases and eloquently stated their basis for why they should not be removed, which included the fact that they had already signed treaties with the United States saying that this land was theirs. They also had large groups of white supporters who spoke out against removal. One group of supporters were white women who were also abolitionists. And I wanted to show you one of the pamphlets created by a woman named Catherine Beecher. And her last name, Beecher, may sound familiar because she was actually the sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, who was perhaps the most famous abolitionist writer. And so this is certainly a family that believes in activism for various causes, Black or Native. So this is what Catherine wrote to the women in her circle. Now, you can definitely say that there are some problematic ideas about Native people in this statement, and you'd see more if you read the whole thing. But still, this is an important effort to stop removal. Unfortunately, treaties and pleas like Catherine's were ignored by Congress and by President Andrew Jackson, and eventually the Cherokees, as well as the Creeks, Seminoles, Chickasaws, Choctaws, and their Black slaves, as well as many other tribes over time, were forced out of the Southeast and into the West, specifically a place called Indian Territory, which is today the state of Oklahoma. You can see then how the shape of Oklahoma comes about. Once they were in Indian Territory, the slave-owning tribes once again set up plantations. They also rebuilt their governments, creating state houses as well as businesses and newspapers. So we've established that it was not only white Americans who engaged in slavery, and therefore in a system that inherently excluded Black people from humanity and from society. Native nations also used the labor of Black people to build wealth and thought of Black people as inherently different and inherently inferior. How do we get to exclusion and inclusion with voting? How do we get to my topic for today? Well, during the Civil War, members of these slaveholding Indian nations were divided, just like white Americans were divided. And so some fought on the side of the Union, the United States, and some fought on the side of the Confederacy. And then during and after the Civil War, when Black Americans were emancipated from slavery in the United States, they were also emancipated from slavery in these Indian nations. And so I'm simplifying things. There's a lot more here. But what's important is that after the war, tribal leaders had to ask themselves the same question that white Americans asked themselves in the 1700s, and then again after the Civil War. And that is, who was included and excluded from our nation? Are Black people going to be citizens? Are they going to have all of the same rights of citizenship as white people, or in this case, as Indians? And they actually make similar choices to the United States, meaning at first, after American pressure, they allow their former slaves to become citizens of their nations with all the accompanying rights of citizenship, like voting and serving on juries and the ability to own property. But just like in the United States, Black inclusion bred resentment among some Native people. In 1888, the successful candidate for governor of the Chickasaw Nation, W.L. Byrd, made Black exclusion part of his campaign promises, saying, and this sort of sentiment wasn't only present in the Chickasaw Nation. When asked what he thought about Black people in his nation, a Cherokee man named William Wilson said that they should be moved out of the nation because this land is Cherokee land, according to him. Where did Wilson think these Black people should go? His response was, Americans have millions of acres of land. Why don't you send them out and settle them on it? Now, at this point, Black people had worked and lived in the Cherokee Nation since the 1700s. So by the time William Wilson makes this comment, there have been Black people in his nation for over 150 years. But to him, they're still not Cherokee. They still don't deserve citizenship or even a place to live in the Cherokee Nation. And so Cherokee slave owners were fine with Black people existing and living in the nation when they were slaves, when they were free labor. But without that, they're useless to people like William, and they should be moved out. Can you imagine how hurtful it would be to hear that? Eventually, William Wilson and others like him get their wish. In the 1970s and 1980s, as tribal governments regain much of their political power that they lost in the 1800s, they push Black citizens out. By 1990, through referendums or legislation or tribal council votes, all 5 of the slaveholding nations, the Cherokees, Creeks, Seminoles, Choctaws, and Chickasaws, have taken back not just voting rights, but citizenship entirely from the Black members of their nations. Most of the Black descendants remain without the tribal citizenship that they are rightfully entitled to. The Black members of the Cherokee Nation had to file multiple lawsuits that went on for over 10 years until a U.S. District Court ruling that allowed them to take back this citizenship. And this is still an issue for all of the Black members of the other slaveholding tribes. This is a BuzzFeed article from 2021. Regardless of your thoughts about the vaccine, you can probably agree that if someone wants it, they should be able to get it. And yet, in this article, multiple Black members of the Seminole tribe talk about how they were discriminated against and were not allowed to get the vaccine because they were told that they're not real tribal members. And this article is actually in your syllabus as well. Black members of the Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw nations cannot vote and were also denied the full rights of citizenship. So the issue of exclusion and inclusion is still very much a topic of conversation in these Indian nations, just like it is in the United States. These 5 slaveholding Indian nations allow us to see how complicated American history is. Through removal, we see how Native people had their rights ignored and violated by white settlers. But we also see how they ignored and violated the rights of the Black people that they enslaved. Yes, they were just following the model of white Europeans and Americans, but that doesn't make it right, just like it doesn't make Indian removal right. Exclusion and inclusion in American history isn't just about white and Black people. Ideas about who has rights and whose rights should be respected changed all the time and was always up for constant debate, and still is. We must understand that American history is a series of choices that different groups of people made and make still about who is and is not part of their community. part of their society. White Americans did it with Black people and with white women, and later with various immigrants and people of color. But Native Americans also did it on a smaller scale. I hope that you learned at least one thing you didn't previously know, and that this knowledge will help you understand how far our country has come, but also how far we have yet to go to make sure that we truly have an inclusive nation. Thank you for listening.